Hello guys, this is Axter from the Players Council speaking, and today we are going to take a look at Shadow, some ups and downs of each culture, and we are going to take a look at the following criteria, which is very similar to the one from the Free People's perspective, because our Shadow side works on very similar principles, just like the Free People's. It means they are trying to achieve something in the game. So first of all, if you let your opponent's conditions do whatever it can, then it is going to be a problem for you. So a shadow strategy is going to be rated according to how well it can get rid of conditions. That's why very often you will see shadow consisting of more than just one culture, because some cultures cannot get rid of conditions. And the same goes for possessions, which is something that might be irritating for you as a shadow player to deal with. So if you play something from a culture which is able to discard positions that the Free People's characters are carrying, that is going to be good for you, and that's why you want to include something like that if there is space for it in the shadow strategy that you are trying to build. Burdens. Why do I have it here in shadow? Because corrupting the ring bearer is one of the ways how to win a game of Lord of the Rings trading card game, and therefore we rate a shadow culture according to how well it is able to add burdens. Strength. What I mean by this is if the shadow culture provides you with some way how to overwhelm the Free People's characters, that can come in handy, because if you overwhelm your opponent's characters, then obviously you have an easier time finishing the Free People's off and therefore winning the game. Wounds are very similar to this principle, because you rate the shadow culture according to how many wounds it is able to put on the opposing Free People's, opposing fellowship. And the last point that I'm going to consider while rating the shadow cultures is the ability to swarm the opponent. That means how well it contributes to having more minions on board than your opponent can fight off. Let's get to it. We are going to start with Isengard, and again I'm going to speak about Fellowship block and Movie block. Movie block with the adjustment that Galadriel is not included. So, what does Isengard offer us? Very important two key characters are both versions of Grima, and the first one limits the Free People's cultures if your opponent gets out of hand. Now, word of note, of course, this does not work in Fellowship because Grima is from set 5 or 4. And the second Grima limits your opponent's unbound companion's equipment. If, for example, Durin gets out of hand, then you want to play 1 or 2 copies of Grima if you don't want to have to deal with such a huge companion. Isengard also provides you with lots of small orcs, so therefore you can create some sort of swarm, but it is different than what we will see in Moria, for example, because these orcs have also a lot of abilities which put wounds on the board in a very interesting way. Typically, you exert an orc in regroup phase and the opponent has to wound the companion, or you discard an orc to do the same effect. So that's definitely a viable strategy and can be built around. There are some ways how to get rid of possessions, but it is not very efficient. For example, Isengard Smith, if you want to discard some sort of possession, it has to be a weapon, or you discard all possessions if your opponent has 5 companions. So to take a look at this, how good it actually is. So if you play Isengard Smith, typically your opponent wins against it because it is a small minion with low strength. He does not have vitality in a regroup to perform his ability, and therefore it's just a waste of 4 Shadow Twilight. So you can play some cards which will make him come to the regroup phase with at least 1 vitality. But then what does the rest of the deck look like? You have to play, for example, Saruman, you have to play some buffs and just to discard your opponent's weapon. So that is probably not going to be worth it. In Fellowship block, you will sometimes see Beyond the Height of Man, which is a very good event. Definitely to discard your opponent's armor or helm, because you want your Uruks to be damage +1, which is their core nature, and it usually pays off to have such minions on board, and armor is something that is preventing you from winning by wounds. Now, a very fascinating minion is Isengard Warrior, which is a natural counter to any archery decks. So if you play this, you don't have to worry about Aragorn's bow, or Greenleaf's ability, or perhaps Condor Bowman, because he simply prevents your opponent from using it in the archery phase. So you can see some combinations of Isengard Orcs with some swarm strategies such as Moria. It is very effective and it can help you win the game. Then there's a bunch of big guys, big Uruks, which usually stay on board and they win the skirmish, also with some buffs. Isengard on its own is able, especially in Fellowship block, to reduce its opponent's Fellowship to lower number of companions, using either Savagery to match their numbers or Greed if the opponent's amount of companions gets out of hand. Then Sarumans are very important minions for the Isengard culture, as it is meant to be. The first one, not only for the Isengard culture but in general, removes any sort of condition. You might argue that 4 Twilight is a huge cost for discarding just one condition, but it is not. First of all, you always want to think about Shadow as a sort of a setup culture, let's say. It is always better to do something small on one side to do something bigger on the next one than to do something mediocre on both sides, because your opponent's Fellowship is going to withstand such force. You always want to create a safe haven for your Shadow, and then you want to double the effort and try to kill your opponent with what you have been preparing. Now let's move on. In Fellowship block, a very key card is Saruman, Keeper of Isengard, which supports Uruks in 2 ways. First of all, he saves them from direct wounding by his response activated ability, and also he makes Uruk-hai fierce, so that means that all the Uruks are twice as dangerous to deal with. And the last Saruman, very underrated. This is basically a direct wounding version of a minion. You can play some sort of deck in which you combine Orthanc Champion and this type of Saruman and some other cards which assign your minions to your opponent's companions, and it is very frustrating to deal with unless your opponent has a way to kill the minions before they get to the assigned preferred skirmish. In Shadow, it is very important to be able to play minions from your hand and from discard pile and perhaps even from the deck, because that way you can use all the Twilight that there is in the pool. And one of the best minions in this culture that does it is Uruk Captain, which plays 1 more Uruk from discard pile, and therefore you use even more Twilight. That's very useful to have. There is little potential for Swarm by Uruks, mostly in Towers block. In Towers Standard, if I'm not wrong, this minion was banned, along with Saruman Keeper and also in the further sets. But for example, in Towers block, this is a very strong way how to kill your opponents, and you can even play him in Movie block, where if you play 8 Uruks and on side 5, typically Steward's Tomb, so that you have a lot of Twilight, you put there 6, 7, 8 Uruks. It's usually a lot for your opponent to deal with, and he loses some companions to it. Then you repeat the same swarm 1 or 2 sides later, and it can be the killing move, so definitely a valid strategy. Now the next card which I selected here to the Isengard culture is Palantir of Orthanc. That is a very important card, because for just 1 Twilight you get to put one of your opponent's cards randomly on the top of the deck. So why would you do that? Well, simply because, firstly, you use all the redundant Twilight that you are left with. It's not enough to play another Uruk or another minion of this culture, but you get to do this. And what does that mean? Well, let's say that your opponent is holding 5 cards in his hand. You play one Uruk, for example Troop of Uruk-hai, you play 5 Twilight, and your opponent has no cards in hand. All of his events have just been returned to the top of his deck. That's as if he had to discard them. What's more, it's actually better, because your opponent then, when he has to play the shadow side, will have his events in his hand in his shadow phase, where they are useless. So this is a very underrated and very strong card. I suggest running at least one copy in your Uruk's deck, because it might win you a lot of games. Another key factor for Isengard culture and in general for Shadow is to cycle through your hand cards which you do not need, and abandoning Reason for Madness is a card that definitely does this. If you have been struggling with Isengard culture, especially in movie block, I highly suggest playing, for example, 3 copies of this, and you will see that it is much easier for you to play this culture, because you will not get into the situation that in your hand you have one Uruk, 3 events, and your opponent just kills that one Uruk and runs. Moving on. A card that is very often used in many other decks, not only in the Isengard oriented ones, is Saruman's Power, because it deals with mass conditions by the Free People's player in the most efficient way. You just discard all of them. You might argue, but what about my conditions? I lose them. Well, you don't usually play many shadow conditions in the deck where you play Saruman's Power, so it's a very important solution if you struggle with mass conditions in Free Peoples. Alright, another card that is very typical for the Isengard culture is Saruman's Snows. It's a very strong condition that basically says all we are down to are our companions and allies and minions. The rest in the skirmish phase just cannot be played or used. It's very strong, especially in combination with some sort of swarm, because if your opponent has Boromir that adds strength to hobbits, then you just prevent him from using his ability and further dies, etc. Another mechanism working in a similar way is Spies of Saruman, which skips the archery phase. Of course, the downside of both these cards is that they are conditions, and therefore cards like Secret Sentinels can get rid of them, unless you run a copy of Palantir of Orthanc. And the last card which I put to this culture's interest is Worry, because it's a little bit of burden that you can lay upon the opponent's ring bearer, and sometimes it can win you the game, because it's very difficult if the Uruks keep winning skirmishes and your opponent suddenly has to deal with getting corrupted as well. Moving on to the next culture, Hillman. This is a very unique shadow culture built around controlling sites. So if you control a couple sites using typically Freka, Hillman Tribe or Wolf, then you combine it with Dunlanding Elder, which is a big minion with lots of damage that he puts on board. That's a simple definition. But what else does this culture open for you? You will not usually see cards from this culture run in other decks. It is a very selfish culture, if we can call it that way. You usually see a deck that is 90% Hillman based, if you decide to play this culture, and the rest are things like, for example, Grima with Saruman's Power, to get rid of your opponent's conditions in a simple way. As you can see, a lot of the Hillman minions have only 1 or 2 vitality. Actually 99%. Saruman is the only exception there. And that creates a problem, because your minions could simply die very easily and then they wouldn't do what they are supposed to do. So that's why you always want to play 4 copies of hides in any Hillman deck that you want to play, because you want your guys to be safe against direct wounding. This shadow strategy is also able to skip archery phase by Hillman Horde's second ability. It's able to discard possessions, it's able to discard conditions, and it's even able to assign individual minions to individual unbound companions and make your opponent move again. That is something that you cannot see until the 13th edition, I believe, where the orc culture enabled it. It is not so easy to achieve making your opponent make another move, but once it happens, it usually means that your opponent is dead. They also have some buffs to make the minions stronger and to punish your opponents from getting too big of a fellowship or having their fellowship in general very unprotected. And the last point that I'm going to make about this culture, it very well uses Twilight, because if you control 2 sides, you get to play minions from your discard piles, and you probably, unless you don't know it already, start to get the trick of this culture. If you control the 2 magical sides, then everything changes. Your Elder gets bigger, you skip the archery phase, you make your opponents move again, if they even don't want to, and everything is built around this magical number of 2 sides that have been taken control of. And without even needing to control anything, you can play constantly threatening, and you can literally constantly threaten your opponent once he moves again, because there will be a bunch of hillmen ready to punish his double move. Next culture is going to be Gollum. This culture is very unique because it is shared with the Free People's Smeagol culture. It is the same one, and some cards even work around this mechanic. And there are only 2 minions in this culture, but the rest of the cards in the culture make up for it in a huge way. So firstly, there is some kind of contribution to putting pressure upon your opponent's ring bearer by Gollum, Darkness, Darkness. Then there are 2 types of Gollum, one using burdens, so for some sort of corruption deck, and there's another type of version of Gollum working around the threats mechanic, which was introduced in King Block first. So the last Gollum that I'm going to talk about is Old Villain, which really efficiently cycles through your hand, unless your opponent gets rid of him before skirmish, or assigns him to Faramir that prevents using skirmish special abilities, etc. But word of advice, you can also prevent a farmer from being assigned to skirmish by Shelob or any other companion that you do not like. It's a very powerful combination, often to be seen in movie block, and it is played even to this day because it's fun and because it's very strong. There are some ways how to put extra minions on board using web. So in a deck where you play web, you stack for example Gollum and Shelob onto web. That means that you have 8 cards in your hand, potentially. Then you play 2 from the web, and you can even play another one using Evil Smelling Fence if you discard it and you choose 1 minion that you want to put on board. So typically your movie block deck is going to look like Gollum, Shelob, and then some versions of minions from other cultures, which are very situational, and according to what you need at that time, you are going to play that sort of minion to punish your opponent. So because there are 2 minions in this culture only, there are some ways how to play Gollum in another way, either by We Must Have It, or Captured by the Ring, or a Dark Shape Sprang. There are some other ways, but these are the most typical ones. And Dark Shape Sprang is something like a surprise event. People tend to forget about it, but in general, if you play against a better player, he is going to have a good idea of you playing this deck in your deck. So you are probably going to surprise somebody playing a casual game, but in a tournament environment, people are going to be on the lookout for this specific card. There is some direct wounding around Golem winning a skirmish, which is very powerful, and it gets combined with one of the most iconic cards of this culture, which is Promise Keeping. So each time a companion takes a wound during a skirmish that involves a Golem minion, exert a companion. You don't have to exert that same companion, which makes it insanely powerful, because what typically happens? You have, for example, Elendil. That's just to showcase a situation of a companion with high vitality. He's assigned to a skirmish with Gollum or the villain. So first off, you discard 3 cards. By they stole it, you wound Elendil. Then you trigger a Promise Keeping. You exert a companion. You don't have to, but you can exert Elendil in that same skirmish. The skirmish still hasn't ended. We have just used one ability. Let's do that one more time. We exert him again, and we wound him again. And what do we do next? Well, we discard unabated in Melis. Yes, that's it. Gollum wins a skirmish. You kill Elendil. Then threats get triggered, still triggering Promise Keeping. And what's left you kill with your Liar and a Thief. Ideal case scenario. Of course, it's going to look like something else in a real world, but it's fun to play, and it's very often one of the decks that opponents don't like to play against if they don't know how to beat it. There are some buffs to make your minions stronger, especially Gollum and Shelob, which are the only 2 minions in this culture. A condition that makes Gollum fierce, and a condition that prevents archery and maneuver special abilities from happening through just exerting Gollum. This is very useful in a lot of decks. Alright, moving on to the Mordor culture. So, of course, in Movie Block, the most iconic deck are Besiegers, but I didn't want to put it on today's list because they are such an individual deck themselves that it wouldn't really speak about this culture's core. I forgot one card, that's why I added it here. Now let's take a look at what we have here. First of all, Great Hill Troll. That's a simple way in Movie Block how to get rid of conditions, and it's also a big tough guy that can overwhelm companions or at least put 2 wounds on board. There is a very important minion called Mordor Fighter, which gives you initiative. That is something that on its own doesn't do anything, but opens up a lot of ways how to defeat your opponent's fellowship. There is some potential to pair this culture up with Wraith cards, Wraith minions and culture through Morgul's Skulker. Another example of discarding a condition is Orc Patrol, which is very often played. There are some other ways how to discard conditions in this culture, but usually they are not so good. Sauron, such a very iconic card of this culture, is one of the best ways how to use Twilight in this game. There are some ways how to get rid of allies, either through Tower Assassin or Memory of Many Things, in a very simple way, and that is something to consider playing, especially in Fellowship Block. Troll of Kirith Gorgor is one of the best Mordor minions that you can find, and that is because he punishes very hard dwarves for playing so many possessions, and also just for 7 Twilight, 4 wounds which he puts on board. That is a very good price. Grond is another example of getting rid of your opponent's conditions, possessions, and even artifacts and allies, which is something that not many cards in this game are able to do. And you can do this repetitively. Some people hate this card. I say that it is perfectly fair, because if you discard, for example, your Troll of Kirith Gorgor to get rid of your opponent's Anduril, well, then your opponent is able to make a double move and your troll is gone. So I would say that it is a fair trade. Now, Ether Stone. That's a card that supports Swarm in a way, but it especially makes it possible to play some sort of a troll based deck where you play 4 copies of Edelstone, 4 copies of Great Troll, and 4 copies of Troll of Kerit Gorgor, and you just play them like there's no tomorrow, and your opponent dies due to wounds, and that is supported by Hate, my most favorite event in the game, because it's a very simple, low-cost, direct wounding event in maneuver, and it's very good to punish your opponent's double moves in general. So let's say that he assigns his Aragorn, he's fine, he's ready to make a double move, and then you kill the Aragorn off by using Hate, because your opponent was too greedy and he didn't stop to heal up. 2 more events that I want to mention. This one is just to get rid of a condition in another way, but more importantly, there is a direct punishment for playing Galadriel, and yes, this works on the opponent's ring bearer, Galadriel, as well. So a little bit of an NPE, but it can work out very well if your shadow strategy struggles only with Galadriel. And the last card here, the ring is mine. This supports corruption in a very, very strong way, because you add 1 burden and you play this event for 0 cost. You just spot a murder minion and another burden is on board. Alright, moving on. Moria is the next one. The culture of swarm, mostly. There are some ways how to add burdens, but they are usually quite difficult to get to, or they are somehow complicated. This culture is mostly thriving in Fellowship block, where a lot of people try to swarm their opponents. There are some ways how to directly wound your, or not directly, actually indirectly wound your opponent's free peoples by some archery abilities, but it's not very efficient, just due to the cost of the minions. It was poorly designed. Then, what actually makes the swarm possible? Well, 2 things. Firstly, you get to add Twilight by certain minions, and secondly, you get to draw a lot of cards by Goblin Scimitar and Goblin Scavengers. And then you get to play minions from your discard pile or from cards like Goblin Swarms. That makes it extra good for your shadow, and you can support your swarm in such a way, and your opponent can fall due to this pressure that you put upon him. A very important part of the culture is the Balrog, which in one version skips the archery phase, so it can be extra punishing against the archery based decks, but he is only playable on side 4 and mostly on side 5 in Fellowship block. Everywhere else he just gets discarded, and that's why you usually see him played only once per a Fellowship game, per a Fellowship block game. The second version plays minions from discard pile, but doesn't skip archery phase, so it is of course better to play this version of Balrog in your Moria deck, because you want your other minions to stick on board, and you want to play the Durin's Bane in your other decks, because it is a very simple alternative way how to punish your opponent's free peoples on side 5, if you are not holding anything too good at that point. There are some ways how to directly punish your opponent's individual free people's cultures. Goblin Scrabbler gets rid of an elven condition, and Goblin Warrior gets rid of a dwarven ally or a dwarven condition. You can technically play this in other shadow cultures, but they usually have their own ways how to get rid of conditions or even allies. And the last 2 things that I would like to mention in this culture, last 3 things, apologies. Goblin Armory is another way how to add Twilight to the pool, very useful against chokes and in general to squeeze in Balrog and Cave Troll and stop your opponent or maybe even kill them. But it also prevents a wound, which is a very crucial thing, because direct wounding in archery is very usual in Fellowship block, and it is a very simple way how to prevent one of those wounds from killing your low vitality minions. Then there is a direct punishment for your opponent playing Boromir, which was meant to die according to the film and the book as well, I guess. and your opponent usually doesn't have too many possessions on board when you play this, or you play 2 or 3 copies per side, and that confirms the kill. The last card here is Cave Troll of Moria, one of the best minions in a Fellowship block, and he's so good because he puts 4 wounds on board, and if your opponent moves again, well, then he has to take the 4 wounds again, unless he gets rid of him somehow, which is very complicated. Now moving on to the Raider culture. This culture is unique for getting rid of possessions very easily, thanks to Corsair Marauder, but it also plays some very efficient events, such as Red Wrath or Fierce in Despair, that get rid of individual companions. It's very frustrating for your opponent to deal with. There are some ways how to cycle through your hand, which is very useful, and that's why you see Corsairs paired up with, for example, the Last Alliance of Men and Elves, because the deck includes a lot of copies of individual cards, and that's why Corsair Plunderer helps your shadow, but it also cycles through your hand. Very similar principle is using Ships of Great Draught, which is one of the best cards, and probably the best card this culture has to offer, because it simply gets rid of cards which you don't need at the moment, and it gives them back to you or other ones later in the game, according to the situation. There are some fancy combinations, like Castamero Fumbar using a Raider Halberd, which makes him 22 strength fierce minion, and another deadly combination can be Desert Lord and Seasoned Leader, which exhausts the best companion, leaving only Whirling Strike to finish him off. Another combination is using Small Hope or other cards which add burdens, such as Vision from Afar or Gathering to the Summons, and then punishing those burdens, or even if your opponent bids too much early in the game, using Eastern Captain and Eastern Army, etc., which are there to overwhelm your opponent's companions. You need Twilight for that. That's where Raider Bow or Raider Halberd or even Corsair War Galley can help you somehow to get more Twilight, and that's how you get the mechanic going. There's a way how to get rid of conditions, discovered and also quelled, but I didn't include it because it's essentially the same like discovered. There are some ways how to play minions from discard pile. The best example is by Black Sails of Umbar. So theoretically, in your hand you have 8 cards, then you play 8 minions from your hand, and you play 4 extra Corsairs from your discard pile, so that makes it 12 minions. And you are not finished yet, because if you have successfully secured initiative by using, for example, Corsair or Galley, well, then you can play Underfoot, you can refill your hand and play even more minions. So this culture very well supports some sort of swarm strategy. So there was the direct wounding, some ways how to corrupt your opponent, and that's about it. Now let's take a look at the last culture, which is going to be Wraith. This culture very well punishes your opponent's alternative ring bearers by using either Bilferni or Morgul Brute and Morgul Destroyer or the Witch King. And these cards put pressure upon your opponent's ring bearer. There are some other ways how to do that as well. For example, by using direct burden cards, such as It Wants to Be Found. And when your opponent has that many burdens, you can use Enquia or Toldea or some other cards to punish your opponent for doing that, for having that many burdens. There are some ways how to play minions from discard pile, for example, by Out of Sight and Shot. This is not exactly a discard pile, but if you manage to stack them onto flank into the fray, that gives you another minion, very useful in swarm strategies. And you can also remove a threat to take any Nazgul card into your hand using the Witch King, Morgul King. A very strong minion indeed, because he gives you something that you need according to the situation. There are some simple ways how to get rid of allies using fear, or their power is in terror. There are some ways how to get rid of possessions, either by beauty is fading, which is quite expensive though, but you can use Kantea later in movie block, or the version of Kantea in fellowship block. One of the most iconic cards of this culture that you see in other decks as well is Enquia, which punishes your opponent for playing too many companions. And I forgot one essential minion that does basically the same thing, which is Nertia. And it supports swarm strategies because it plays a minion for each companion over 4. So that means your companion has 9 minions on board, 9 companions on board, excuse me. So you play Nertia, that's 1 minion, you play 5 more, and then you play everything else that you have in your hand, and perhaps you even draw cards using Scimitar. So as you can see, the potential in this card is great, and you actually select which minions you are going to play. Very useful card indeed. There are some ways how to play your minions cheaper by using Morgul Gates. You can prevent your minions from taking individual wounds. You can cycle through your hand and making some of the Nazgul Fears, which are not by default, such as this version of Witch King. And you are also able to punish your opponent for playing Gandalf by using Too Great and Terrible. So I hope I managed to pinpoint the most important cards in the Shadow cultures, and next week I'm going to take a look at a tier list of movie block free people's strategies. Thanks for watching.